For weeks, Jimin had been smiling as if nothing in the world could hurt him. He laughed beside Jungkook, stood beneath the brightest stage lights, and quietly carried a pain no one was supposed to see. But one night, everything changed when Jungkook noticed something hidden inside Jimin's bag, a hospital document bearing a family member's name. Before he could ask, Taehyung discovered another clue that made the situation even more disturbing. Jimin wasn't simply hiding sadness. He had been sacrificing something enormous in silence. And when Jungkook finally learned why, the truth threatened to destroy the bond they had spent years protecting. Jimin had always been the kind of person who could make an ordinary room feel warmer simply by walking into it. Even after exhausting rehearsals, endless schedules, and nights when his body begged for rest, he still found a way to smile when Jungkook appeared beside him. Their bond had grown through years of shared stages, quiet car rides, late-night meals, accidental laughter, and moments when neither of them needed words to understand what the other was feeling. Jungkook had become familiar with every version of Jimin, the energetic one who teased everyone around him, the exhausted one who quietly leaned against the nearest wall after rehearsal, and the vulnerable one who sometimes stared into the distance as though his thoughts had traveled somewhere far beyond the room. Yet there was one version Jungkook had never truly understood, the Jimin who smiled while carrying something unbearable. At first, the changes were almost invisible. Jimin began checking his phone more often, stepping away whenever family notifications appeared, and disappearing for several minutes during breaks. His meals became smaller. His laughter sometimes arrived a second too late, as though he had to force himself to remember how to be cheerful. Jungkook noticed, but Jimin always seemed to recover before anyone could question him. Whenever exhaustion appeared on his face, he covered it with a smile. Whenever his eyes became strangely distant, he redirected everyone's attention with humor. And whenever Jungkook came close to asking whether something was wrong, Jimin somehow made the moment feel insignificant. The others noticed fragments too. RM occasionally watched Jimin from across the rehearsal room with quiet concern. Jin noticed when Jimin stopped touching certain foods he normally enjoyed. Suga recognized the unusual silence that followed Jimin whenever he received a phone call. J-Hope tried to keep the atmosphere light, while Taehyung, perhaps more than anyone, seemed increasingly unsettled by the feeling that Jimin was deliberately keeping everyone outside a locked door. Still, Jimin continued moving forward. His schedule became his shield. Rehearsals gave him somewhere to focus. Performances gave him somewhere to hide. The cameras gave him another reason to smile. But Jungkook began sensing something deeper. There were moments when Jimin looked at him with an expression that disappeared almost immediately, an expression filled with gratitude, fear, and something dangerously close to goodbye. Those moments stayed in Jungkook's mind long after Jimin had walked away. One evening, after another exhausting rehearsal, Jungkook found Jimin sitting alone in a nearly empty practice room. The lights had been dimmed, and the reflection of the city shimmered across the dark windows. Jimin appeared calm, but his posture revealed the truth his face was hiding. His shoulders were tense, his hands were tightly clasped, and his phone rested face down beside him as though he was afraid of what might appear on its screen. Jungkook remained at a distance, sensing that something was wrong, but unable to identify it. Then Jimin's phone vibrated. His entire expression changed. For only a fraction of a second, the warmth vanished from his eyes and was replaced by unmistakable fear. He quickly picked up the phone, read the message, and stood. But before leaving, he accidentally dropped a small envelope from his bag. He did not notice it. Jungkook did. The envelope looked ordinary, but something about Jimin's reaction after realizing it was missing made the moment impossible to forget. Jimin returned moments later, retrieved it with trembling fingers, and pressed it against his chest before slipping it away. Jungkook wanted to stop him. He wanted to demand the truth. Instead, he watched Jimin walk down the hallway with the same familiar smile he had worn all day. That smile suddenly looked different. It no longer seemed like happiness. It looked like protection. And somewhere inside Jungkook, a frightening realization began to take shape. Jimin wasn't hiding a bad day. He was hiding an entire world of pain. The realization changed the way Jungkook saw every moment that followed. What had once seemed like small inconsistencies suddenly became pieces of a pattern he could no longer ignore. Jimin was still smiling, still attending rehearsals, still making everyone around him laugh. But beneath that familiar rhythm, something was steadily breaking. Jungkook began noticing how often Jimin checked his phone before entering a room, how quickly he silenced notifications, and how frequently he stepped outside whenever his family was mentioned. The more Jungkook observed, the more convinced he became that Jimin was carrying something alone. Yet every attempt to understand him seemed to create greater distance. Jimin became unusually careful around Jungkook, almost as though he could sense that the younger man's attention had changed. Their usual closeness remained on the surface, but something invisible had entered the space between them. Jungkook began questioning every smile, every excuse, every sudden disappearance. One afternoon, Jimin left rehearsal earlier than expected. He claimed through his actions that everything was under control, but his face told another story. Jungkook watched him leave with a heavy feeling in his chest, and when he later saw Jimin standing alone near the building entrance, his suspicions deepened. Jimin was holding his phone with both hands, staring at the screen as tears quietly gathered in his eyes. Before anyone could approach, he wiped them away and returned to the building wearing that same flawless smile. Jungkook saw everything. He simply could not understand why Jimin would rather suffer alone than allow the people closest to him to help. Taehyung noticed the same change. Unlike Jungkook, however, he did not immediately try to confront Jimin. He began quietly watching the details instead. The unanswered calls, the sudden trips, the envelopes that appeared and disappeared, the exhaustion that Jimin tried to disguise beneath expensive clothing and carefully arranged hair. One evening, Taehyung accidentally saw Jimin leaving with a folder pressed tightly against his chest. The folder contained several medical documents, but before Taehyung could see the name clearly, Jimin noticed him and immediately hid it. That moment confirmed something neither of them wanted to believe. Someone in Jimin's family was facing a serious situation, and Jimin had apparently decided that no one else needed to know. But the mystery became even more painful when Jungkook discovered that Jimin had been canceling personal plans to handle something outside their normal schedule. Jungkook began to feel excluded. It wasn't simply concern anymore. It was hurt. For years, he had believed that Jimin trusted him with the parts of himself that no one else could see. Now Jimin was protecting a secret so carefully that Jungkook began wondering whether their bond had ever been as deep as he believed. That doubt became dangerous. One night, Jungkook noticed Jimin quietly placing an envelope into the pocket of his coat. The same kind of envelope from the practice room. Something inside Jungkook finally overwhelmed his patience. He followed Jimin from a distance, hoping to understand where he was going. Instead of returning home, Jimin entered a quiet building and remained there for nearly an hour. When he finally emerged, his eyes were red, and he looked physically drained. Jungkook stayed hidden. He watched Jimin stop beneath a streetlight and count a small amount of cash in his hands. The sight shattered something inside him. Jimin looked nothing like the confident performer everyone knew. He looked like someone trying to solve a problem far larger than himself. But then another car arrived. Jimin approached it and handed over an envelope. The person inside accepted it before driving away. Jungkook could not hear what happened, but the scene looked suspicious enough to create an entirely different fear. He wondered whether Jimin was being pressured by someone. He wondered whether the family situation was more complicated than anyone knew. And most painfully, he wondered whether Jimin had made a decision that could put himself in danger. The next morning, Jungkook's anxiety turned into frustration. Jimin arrived late to rehearsal and looked exhausted, yet he immediately tried to act normal. Jungkook could barely contain his emotions. Instead of reaching toward him, he became distant. Jimin noticed the change instantly. The emotional distance between them widened throughout the day. Jimin seemed hurt by Jungkook's coldness, while Jungkook interpreted Jimin's silence as another refusal to trust him. Neither understood that they were both reacting to the same fear. One was afraid of losing the other by revealing the truth. The other was afraid of losing him because the truth was being hidden. Taehyung eventually realized how badly the misunderstanding was growing. He saw Jungkook's frustration and Jimin's quiet despair, but even he did not yet know the entire story. Then he found something that changed everything. While helping organize belongings after rehearsal, Taehyung discovered a document that had accidentally fallen behind a cabinet. It contained a hospital name, a treatment schedule, and a family member's name. The details were enough to reveal that Jimin's family had been dealing with a serious medical crisis for months. But there was another detail that made Taehyung freeze. The financial records showed repeated payments connected to treatment expenses, and the amounts were far beyond what Jimin could comfortably manage. Suddenly, the unexplained disappearances made sense. The late nights made sense. The exhaustion made sense. The envelopes made sense. But one question remained unanswered. Where had Jimin been getting the money? Taehyung quietly searched through the available information and discovered that Jimin had been selling personal belongings and postponing his own plans to cover expenses. There was no evidence of anyone forcing him. There was only evidence of sacrifice. Yet before Taehyung could tell Jungkook, another revelation appeared. Jimin had apparently refused financial assistance from everyone around him. He had deliberately kept the crisis private because he believed accepting help would place an unbearable burden on the people he loved. To Jimin, suffering alone was easier than watching Jungkook, Taehyung, where the others feel responsible for saving his family. But the secret had already begun damaging the very relationships he was trying to protect. Jungkook's frustration reached its breaking point when he found Jimin alone after rehearsal, visibly struggling to remain standing. Instead of approaching him with tenderness, Jungkook remained silent, still wounded by the belief that Jimin did not trust him. Jimin looked toward him with tired eyes, seemingly wanting to explain everything but unable to find the strength. That silence became the cruelest misunderstanding of all. Jimin believed Jungkook was angry because he had become a burden. Jungkook believed Jimin was pushing him away because he no longer considered him important. Neither knew that the other was hurting for exactly the opposite reason. Days passed, and the pressure intensified. Jimin's family situation worsened. His responsibilities increased, and his physical exhaustion became impossible to hide. During a major performance preparation, he nearly collapsed backstage. He recovered before anyone could react, and returned to rehearsals as if nothing had happened. But Jungkook saw the moment. He saw Jimin gripping the wall, breathing heavily, his eyes closed as though every ounce of strength had disappeared. Instead of asking for help, Jimin straightened himself and walked away. Jungkook felt anger rising inside him, but beneath it was terror. He was beginning to realize that this was no longer simply about a secret. Jimin was destroying himself to keep everyone else safe. Then came the message that changed the situation completely. Jimin received news from the hospital indicating that his family needed immediate financial support for another critical stage of treatment. His hands trembled as he read it. For the first time, the mask completely disappeared. He lowered his head, and silent tears fell onto the screen. He had reached the limit of what he could sacrifice. Yet instead of turning to the people who loved him, Jimin made one final decision. He planned to give up something deeply important to himself, something he had spent years building toward, because he believed it was the only way to save his family. Jungkook knew nothing about that decision. Taehyung did, and when Taehyung finally understood what Jimin was preparing to sacrifice, he realized that keeping the secret any longer could cost Jimin far more than money. It could cost him the future he had worked so hard to protect. The truth was finally moving toward them, but before it could be revealed, Jimin disappeared. His phone was turned off. His belongings were left behind. His schedule was suddenly empty. Jungkook searched everywhere he could think of, while Taehyung desperately tried to understand where Jimin had gone. Then an unexpected piece of information reached them. Jimin had been seen entering the hospital alone. Jungkook's heart sank. For months, Jimin had hidden his family's suffering behind a smile, and now he was facing the worst moment without anyone beside him. Jungkook finally understood that his anger had been misplaced. The distance he had created was not protecting him from pain. It was leaving Jimin alone at the exact moment he needed someone most. And as Jungkook and Taehyung rushed toward the hospital, neither of them knew that the truth waiting behind those doors would force Jungkook to confront the most painful question of all. How much had Jimin sacrificed simply because he was afraid of becoming a burden to the people he loved? The hospital corridor was almost silent when Jungkook arrived, yet the silence felt louder than any concert hall he had ever stood in. The fluorescent lights reflected across the polished floor, turning the long hallway into something cold and unfamiliar. Taehyung was beside him, carrying the weight of everything they had discovered, but neither of them could find comfort in knowing that the mystery was finally close to being solved. Jungkook's heart was racing because every step toward the hospital room felt like a step toward a truth he feared he had already misunderstood. At the end of the corridor, they found Jimin sitting alone. He was bent forward in a chair, his hands clasped tightly together, his head lowered. The fashionable clothes that usually made him look confident now appeared almost meaningless. His face was pale, his hair slightly disheveled, and the exhaustion beneath his eyes was impossible to hide. For the first time, there was no smile, no performance, no carefully constructed mask. There was only Jimin, completely overwhelmed by everything he had been carrying. Taehyung stopped several steps away. Jungkook could barely breathe. Months of unanswered questions suddenly became visible in the silence surrounding Jimin. The hospital documents, the late nights, the envelopes, the money, the disappearing acts, the tears he had hidden, the strange distance between them. None of it had been betrayal. None of it had been rejection. It had been sacrifice. But the discovery still had another layer. Jungkook noticed a document lying beside Jimin. It contained information about a treatment payment that had been made recently, along with evidence that Jimin had transferred almost everything he had available. Another document revealed that Jimin had canceled a major personal commitment and surrendered something he had been looking forward to for years. He had chosen his family's survival over his own future. Jungkook felt the realization strike with devastating force. While he had been feeling abandoned, Jimin had been quietly giving pieces of his own life away. While Jungkook had interpreted silence as rejection, Jimin had been fighting a battle he never wanted anyone else to witness. Taehyung finally understood why Jimin had hidden everything. It was not because he lacked trust. It was because he loved them enough to believe their lives should not be consumed by his problems. Jimin had convinced himself that being strong meant suffering privately. He had mistaken protection for isolation, and that mistake had nearly destroyed the people closest to him. When Jimin finally noticed them, his expression changed. Fear appeared first, followed by embarrassment, then something much more painful. He looked as though being discovered was somehow worse than the crisis itself. His shoulders tightened, and his eyes moved away from Jungkook. He seemed unable to face the person whose concern he had avoided for so long. Jungkook felt his anger disappear completely. In its place came guilt. He remembered every moment when he had deliberately kept his distance. Every time he had looked at Jimin and chosen not to ask what was wrong because he believed Jimin did not want him involved. He remembered how Jimin's eyes had searched for him during those moments, quietly hoping for reassurance while receiving silence instead. The misunderstanding suddenly became unbearable. Jungkook realized that he had been punishing Jimin for hiding pain that Jimin had never known how to share. Taehyung then revealed what he had discovered about the financial situation. Jimin had been selling personal belongings, postponing his own needs, and using nearly every resource available to keep his family members' treatment moving forward. He had even refused help that had been quietly offered through others because he was afraid that accepting it would create obligations he could never repay. The revelation broke something inside Jungkook. He had always admired Jimin's kindness, but he had never realized how far that kindness could go when turned against himself. Jimin had not simply sacrificed money. He had sacrificed sleep, comfort, opportunities, pride, and eventually his own sense of worth. Then came the truth Jimin had hidden most carefully. The envelope Jungkook had seen was not evidence of a secret relationship, betrayal, or dangerous arrangement. It contained financial documents and a handwritten plan detailing everything Jimin intended to give up so his family could continue receiving treatment. The final item on the list was devastating. Jimin had planned to step away from an important professional opportunity that meant more to him than anyone realized. He believed disappearing temporarily would allow him to work elsewhere, earn enough money, and avoid forcing the people around him to become involved. Jungkook finally understood why Jimin had looked at him with that strange expression that seemed almost like goodbye. Jimin had been preparing to leave without explaining why. He had convinced himself that disappearing was an act of love. Jungkook could not accept that. The thought of Jimin walking away alone after everything they had shared felt unbearable. The emotional wall Jimin had built for months finally began to collapse. Tears appeared in his eyes as the pressure he had carried alone became too heavy to contain. The hours that followed were quieter than anyone expected. There was no dramatic celebration, no sudden miracle that erased months of fear, and no easy solution to the problems waiting inside the hospital. The reality remained painfully complicated. Jimin's family still needed care. The financial pressure had not disappeared, and the emotional wounds created by months of secrecy could not be repaired in a single night. But something had changed that mattered more than any immediate solution. Jimin was no longer sitting alone in the corridor, trying to calculate how much more of himself he could sacrifice. For the first time in months, he allowed the people closest to him to stand beside him. That simple decision became the beginning of his healing. Jungkook remained nearby through the long hours, quietly observing Jimin's exhausted face. The person sitting beside him looked different from the Jimin everyone knew on stage. There was no polished smile, no carefully controlled expression, and no attempt to appear invincible. Yet somehow, Jungkook found this version of Jimin more honest than anything he had seen in months. He finally understood that strength had never been the problem. Jimin had simply been using strength against himself. Every time life became difficult, he had convinced himself that he needed to become stronger, quieter, more independent, and more useful to everyone around him. He had treated his own emotions as something that could be postponed until everyone else was safe. But emotions did not disappear when ignored. They accumulated quietly until even the strongest person could no longer carry them. Taehyung understood that better than anyone that night. He had watched Jimin build the wall piece by piece, believing that secrecy was protecting everyone. Now he saw that the wall had also trapped Jimin inside his own fear. The others slowly learned the details of what had happened. RM discovered how long Jimin had been managing the situation. Jean learned about the personal belongings Jimin had sold. Suga discovered the commitments Jimin had canceled. J-Hope realized how many times Jimin had smiled during moments when he was probably struggling to keep himself together. Each discovery created a different kind of silence. It was not silence born from anger. It was the silence that comes when people realize how badly they misunderstood someone's pain. They had all seen Jimin smile and assumed he was okay. None of them had understood that the smile itself had become part of his survival strategy. Jimin eventually began accepting help, but even then, it was difficult for him. Every small act of support made him uncomfortable at first. He had spent so long believing that receiving anything meant owing something in return that kindness itself felt frightening. Jungkook noticed this immediately. He did not try to force Jimin into becoming comfortable overnight. Instead, he stayed consistent. That consistency became more important than any grand gesture. There were mornings when Jimin still tried to handle everything alone. There were evenings when he became quiet after receiving an update from the hospital. There were moments when his old instinct returned, telling him to hide his worry and protect everyone from it. But now someone noticed, and instead of allowing the silence to grow, the people around him remained present. Slowly, Jimin began to understand that being supported did not mean losing his independence. It meant allowing love to exist in both directions. For years, he had given care freely but struggled to receive it. Now he was learning that people who truly loved him did not want a perfect version of him. They wanted the real one, including the frightened, exhausted, uncertain version he had tried so desperately to hide. Jungkook's relationship with Jimin also changed. Their closeness returned gradually rather than instantly. There were still moments when Jungkook remembered the weeks of distance and felt guilty. He wondered whether he should have noticed sooner, whether he should have trusted his instincts, and whether one more question might have prevented Jimin from carrying everything alone. But eventually he understood that guilt could become another form of selfishness if he allowed it to consume him. The past could not be changed. What mattered was what he chose to do with what he had learned. He chose patience. He chose consistency. He chose to stop assuming that silence meant rejection. He learned to recognize the small signs Jimin used when he was struggling, not because Jimin was incapable of speaking, but because healing often begins before someone finds the courage to explain their pain. Jimin, in return, began learning how to trust without testing people first. He stopped disappearing whenever something became difficult. He began sharing small pieces of his worries before they became overwhelming. Those small changes seemed insignificant to everyone else, but to Jungkook, they represented enormous progress. One evening, weeks after the hospital crisis had begun to stabilize, Jimin returned to the practice room alone. The same room where Jungkook had first noticed the envelope was almost empty. The city lights still shimmered beyond the windows, but the atmosphere felt completely different. Jimin stood near the same spot where he had once sat with his phone in his hands, terrified of what the future might bring. This time, he was not hiding anything. The envelope that had once represented secrecy rested openly on the table. It no longer looked like evidence of a hidden life. It had become a reminder of how close he had come to losing himself while trying to save someone else. Jungkook eventually entered the room and noticed it immediately. He did not need to ask what it meant. Jimin had left it there intentionally. That small act carried more meaning than any explanation could have. It showed that Jimin was no longer ashamed of needing help. The relationship between them became stronger because it was no longer based on the illusion that either of them had to be invulnerable. They had learned that trust was not the absence of secrets. Trust was the courage to reveal what fear told you to hide. The family situation continued to require patience, treatment, and difficult decisions, but Jimin no longer carried those responsibilities in isolation. The financial burden was managed through support, careful planning, and sacrifices that were shared rather than secretly endured. Jimin still worried. He still had difficult days. He still occasionally stared at his phone with fear when a hospital notification appeared. But the difference was profound. He no longer had to pretend that he was unaffected. When difficult news arrived, he had people beside him. When fear became overwhelming, he could let someone see it. When exhaustion became too heavy, he could rest without believing that rest made him weak. The experience also changed the way the entire group viewed one another. They began paying attention to the emotions behind the smiles, understanding that the happiest person in a room might sometimes be the one struggling the most. They became more careful with silence. They learned that asking someone whether they were truly okay could sometimes be more meaningful than offering a solution. And, perhaps most importantly, they learned that love was not only about protecting someone from pain. Sometimes love meant allowing someone to share the pain with you. Jimin's greatest lesson came slowly. He had spent so long believing that sacrifice was the highest form of love that he had forgotten another truth. Sacrifice without boundaries can become self-destruction. Loving his family did not require him to abandon himself. Loving Jungkook did not require him to hide his struggles. Protecting the people he cared about did not mean denying them the opportunity to care for him. Once he understood that, something inside him became lighter. The smile on his face gradually returned, but it was different now. Before, his smile had been a shield. Now, it could finally be genuine. Jungkook noticed the difference first. The smile no longer appeared automatically whenever someone looked at him. It came naturally, sometimes unexpectedly, without the exhaustion that had once lived behind his eyes. One day, Jimin laughed during rehearsal and then suddenly stopped, as if he had realized something. He looked around at the people beside him and seemed to recognize how different his life had become. Months earlier, He had been convinced that hiding his pain was the only way to keep everyone together.